Okay, good morning everybody. Today's daf is Nun, and we are going to start on Mem Tet Amud Bet, bottom of the page, where it says Begizei Tzemer Ve'in Metaltalin. We said that, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the bottom of the Amud. So it says, this is talking about hatmana, which is insulating pots with various makeshift materials. Remember, they didn't go to Walmart or Target and buy insulation. They used whatever they had around. So they would use various makeshift things, and one of the things that they would use was gizei tzemer, the shearing of the sheep that they had around was a good insulator. So it says you can use this to insulate your pot from before Shabbat if you want to keep it warm. But you can't handle the gizei tzemer. It says vein metaltalin. So the question, so now the Gemara is going to try to deal with this. Amar Rava says, when it's really two halachot. Rava says, one halacha is you can use gizei tzemer, you can use the shearing of the sheep to insulate your pot, and a separate halacha is that you can't touch it. In other words, if you didn't use it for insulation, that's when you can't touch it. But if you use them for insulation, you could handle them on Shabbat. In other words, if you just have gizei tzemer in your house, you just have shearings of sheep in your house, they're mukteh, they don't have any Shabbat use. Okay? But if you use them for insulation that Shabbat, you can move them, no problem, because you gave them a purpose. That's what Rava says. So he says it's two different halachot. When it says you can use it for insulation, that's one thing. When it says you can't handle it, that's when you didn't use it for insulation. That's a separate thing. That was about the wetness, the moist versus the dry. That was from yesterday. So, there was somebody who was new in the class. It was his first day in the Beit Midrash. He was a newbie, and he had a question. He said, wait a second. It says, Tomnin begizei tzemer vein metaltalin otan. It says you can use gizei tzemer, shearing of sheep, to insulate, and you can't handle the shearings themselves. Ketzadu said, what does he do? Notel takisui, as we turn to Nun Amud Aleph, he takes the top off of the pot, vein noflot, and they'll fall off by themselves. What does that show you? Obviously, even though you insulated with it, you still can't handle it. Because why would it have to tell you to indirectly take the pot off and let them fall off if you're allowed to handle them when they were used for insulation? So I wonder why it took somebody new to the class to figure this out. It seems like a rather obvious point, but I don't know. He's thinking out of the box. No pun intended, because they actually used boxes for this. But that's
cut the kisui.
Yeah. So, Ela ietmar hachietmar. Rather, this is what Rava said. Amar Rava lo sheno ela she'lo yichadan lahatmana. What it means is that what he meant was it's not dependent on whether you used these shearings for this particular Shabbat or not. It's whether these shearings were designated for this use or not. In other words, if you had shearings that are specifically set aside for insulating pots, those are okay. It's just that when you happen to take some shearings that you had around that are really for something else, but you use them temporarily for this, they don't lose their mukteh status just because you temporarily use them for hatmana. So Itmar Nami was similarly stated. Kiyata Ravin Amar Rabbi Yaakov Amar Rabbi Asi. So that when Ravin came from Israel, that Rabbi Yaakov said that Rabbi Asi said, that Rabbi Asi ben Shaul said, Amar Rabbi, that Rabbi himself said, Rabbi Hakadosh, Lo shanu el shelo yichadan atmana val yichadan atmana b'tatlin otan. Same thing, that if these shearings were specifically designated that this is insulation for pots, that's a different story. If you took some gizei tzemer that were for something else, and you temporarily just put them on your pot to insulate them, because that's all you had around, it doesn't lose its mukteh status in that case. Ravina says, Bishel heptek shanu. Actually, our Mishnah is talking about something else. Really, if you used, even temporarily, even on the fly, you used these gizei tzemer, these shearings of wool to insulate your pots, they lose their mukteh status according to Ravina. They lose it. However, if you took shearing that had a clear alternative designation, they were merchandise. Okay, shel heptek means they were merchandise, and you borrowed them, so you know that you're borrowing them, you're going to put it back right after Shabbat because it's part of the merchandise that you're selling. Okay? So if that's the case, then the fact that you use them for insulation is not going to remove the mukteh status. So that's what it means. So Tanya Nami Achi, we learned in a Braita similarly, Gizei tzemer shel heptek en metaltalin otan v'im hitkinan balabait lishtamesh ben metaltalin otan. If he designated them as insulation, they were no longer for sale, that's a different story. Okay, so this is how the Shulchan Aruch rules. By the way, the Shulchan Aruch rules. There's a machloket rishonim how we conclude this sugya, but basically, the Shulchan Aruch rules the lenient interpretation that stam, without any other designation, we assume that if you used these shearings of wool for insulation on this particular Shabbat, those shearings are not muktzeh. Okay, if they were merchandise, then unless they were specifically declared not to be merchandise, they're going to retain that status. But stam, if you just took gizei tzemer, we assume you're giving them the designation for insulation.
Today, if you go to your closet and take towels and stuff like that.
Right, well, towels wouldn't be booked anyway because they have a Shabbat use anyway. So it wouldn't be as big of an issue.
So that's considered to be designated?
Well, because they're already designated. Even their other purpose is also for Shabbat. So it's not as big of a deal. As opposed to Gizei Tzemer, their other purpose is either merchandise, selling, commercial purpose, or making it into cloth, or making it into clothing, which is not allowed on Shabbat. So either alternative designation wouldn't be good.
Maybe by analogy, if a person had a store that sold towels, you can't just take those in the middle of the
Right, that's a good point. Right, you're right, yeah. That would be right. Unless you decided I'm keeping this one. Right, exactly. That's a very good example.
Can you make a general statement, a general gezerah, that everything inside my house that could potentially have a use on Shabbat?
Well, that's kind of like the machloket between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. That's basically their basic machloket. That Rabbi Shimon says that we assume that a person wants to have in mind for anything that could possibly be used on Shabbat, no matter what it is. Right, and Rabbi Yehuda says no, it needs to be specific. That's the whole machloket. No, that if there's something that by its nature wouldn't lend itself to Shabbat use, you would have had to designate it. That's the whole machloket. And Rabbi Shimon is saying that basically that's what you're saying is what Rabbi Shimon is saying. Yesterday you had Tosafot, today you have Rabbi Shimon. Yeah. We basically follow a hybrid between the two, not one or the other. So it's hard to say one or the other because we take mostly Rabbi Yehuda's position with regard to Shabbat, but then qualified a little bit. This is raw form. Gizei tzemer means raw shearings. So, So Tana was stated separately. Tana Rabba bar Bachana kamei derav. Rabba bar Bachana taught in front of Rav. That's a verb. Hariyot shel dekel shegidran la'etzim. That if you had some wood from a palm tree that you set aside for firewood, shegidran la'etzim, you cut it up for firewood. V'nimlach alehen li'shiva, but you decided you want to sit on it instead. You want to make a little mat on the floor and sit on it. Tzarich likasher. In order to show that this wood is no longer for the purposes of a firewood, but it's going to be for a seat, you have to tie it together. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, you don't have to tie them together. According to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, the fact that you designated them to be a seat is enough. You said, I'm going to take these sticks, they're going to be a seat. You don't have to do anything physically with them. Hu tanila v'hu amarla. He taught this. In other words, Rabbi Bar Bachana taught this, and then he explained it. Halacha ka Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and the halacha follows Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel that you don't have to physically do anything to change the sticks, like tie them together. It's enough to say we're using these sticks as a seat. Itmar was stated. Rav Amar kosher, u'Shmuel Amar choshev, v'Rav Asi Amar yoshev. Rhymes, okay? So Rav says you have to tie it together. In other words, you have to do something physical to redesignate these sticks. Okay, Shmuel says, choshev. All you have to do is say, I'm designating them. You don't have to physically do anything. And Rav Asi says, you don't have to do or say anything. Just use it right before Shabbat to sit on it for 1 second, and that's enough. If you sat on it for 1 second, that shows you wanted to use it. Okay? Before Shabbat, obviously it means. It doesn't mean on Shabbat. It means before Shabbat, you sit on it for a minute, that's enough. You don't have to say anything, you don't have to think anything. If you used it for that, even if you didn't specifically say, I hereby designate these sticks for a seat, but you sat on them before Shabbat, so we see that you want to use it for that. So, okay. So, so even though he didn't tie it and he didn't think anything. So now we understand Rav is following the first Tana that we mentioned before. The first Tana said you need to tie them. That's what Rav is saying. And Shmuel is following Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who said you don't need to tie it, but you do need to declare it. But Rav Asi is not following anybody. Neither of the two opinions we saw before allowed you to just sit on the sticks before Shabbat. Each one said you had to do something. Either you got to tie them, or you have to declare. but you can't just sit on them. So where did Rav Asi get his position? So the answer is Hud de Amar ki haytana. He was following a different Tana that's not mentioned in the Braita that we talked about before, that we cited, but is mentioned in another Braita. The Tanya, as it says in another Braita, Yotzin b'pakorin u'b'tzipa b'zman shetziva'an u'krachan b'mshicha. Lo tziva'an, and some have it here to say b'shemen, okay, and some don't. V'lo krachan b'mshicha. אין יוצאים בהן, ואם יצא בהן שעה אחת מבעוד יום, אף על פי שלא ציבה ולא קרחן, במשיכה, מותר לצאת בהן. So basically what this is talking about is, you would have these pieces of wool that was combed wool, but it was raw wool. So normally this raw wool would be mukteh. But what they would do was, let's say you had a cut on your arm or a blister or something like that. You don't want your clothing to rub against it, because if it rubs against it, it's going to bother it, like a Band-Aid, basically. So they would take these, they didn't have the idea of keeping it protected from infection. They were talking about just keeping it protected from the discomfort of the clothing. So they would tie these gizeh tzemer, or they would tie these strings of wool around the wound, and that way it would prevent the wound from being irritated by your clothing. Now the way they would do that was they would dip it in oil and they would tie it, okay, and that would make it adhere to the wound. So the point is that normally this wool, raw wool, would be mukteh, but if you either dipped it in oil because you wanted to use it as a bandage, or you tied it into a type of bandage, or he says even if you didn't do either of those things, you didn't dip it and you didn't tie it, but you put it on your arm and you went out with it before Shabbat for that purpose, that's enough. So you see that's what Rav Asi is saying. He's saying either you do something to designate this item and show that you want to designate it for a Shabbat purpose, or you have to use it for that purpose before Shabbat, and that speaks itself. In other words, it speaks for itself that you used it for that before Shabbat. And the whole concern here is, Rashi says that the issue is tiltul mukteh, that it's a mukteh thing, this wool. Others say that it could have to do with hotza'ah, with carrying. You're showing by wearing it before Shabbat that you're not transporting that wool, it's functioning as part of your clothing, because it's preventing the upper clothing from irritating your arm.
I could be confused with regards to the Band-Aid, because there's a discussion, I think in the Shulchan Aruch, I'm not sure if it's the Shulchan, but with regards to the Band-Aid, that there's a problem with using medicated Band-Aid because of the medication.
It's refu'ah, because it's refu'ah, that's a different thing. That's a different thing, right? But here we're not talking about that. We're just talking about preventing irritation, not refu'ah. Rashi says that specifically. Right. He specifically says we're not talking about medicated. It's not a medication. It's just protection. So Amar Rav Ashi said, we also learned this in another source. We learned this before. And this is found later on in the Masekhet. Hakash al gabe amita, that if there's straw lying on the bed, lo yinane obiado, aval minane obigufo. You realize you had some straw that was set aside for some sort of building or some kind of, to make bricks or whatever it was for, a non-Shabbat use, and you accidentally left it on your bed. So now you come on Shabbat and you want to sleep on your bed, you can't move it, it's mukteh. So what do? He says you can't move it with your hand, but you can move it with your body, meaning get into bed and knock it over. Like the way that the monkeys that were in the bed, they said move over. So you just get in and you push it over. Now, aval imaya machal behema, if it was designated for the food of an animal, that's not mukteh. O shayat lavkar o sadin miba'od yom minan obiado. Or if you put as Rashi explains here, that you went to lie down with the straw there before Shabbat. Okay, so then, in other words, you put that straw normally would be used for building or for making bricks, but you actually threw a blanket on it and you slept on it before.
You made it bedding.
Yeah, you made it bedding, right? Because people would do that; they would sleep on straw, right? So you made it bedding basically before Shabbat. You didn't have to say, "I hereby declare you as bedding." No, the fact that you threw the sheet on there and you took a nap for 5 minutes shows that you wanted it to be bedding. It's enough. Actions speak louder than words. That's what we say. So then, Shemamina, that's what you see from there. Who is really the one that disagrees with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel? Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, again, is the one who says that you need to declare. You don't need to tie, but you need to declare. So who's the one that disagrees with that? Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva. Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva. Dechiata Rav Dimi, because when Rav Dimi came, which means when he came from Israel, Amar Zeiri, he said that Zeiri said, Amar Rabbi Chanina, that Rabbi Chanina said, Pam achat halach Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva lamakom echad. Once upon a time, Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva came to a certain place. Umatzach hariyot shel dekel shegiderum l'shu metzim. And he saw that there were a bunch of pieces of wood that had been cut for firewood, and it was Shabbat. V'amar lahem l'talmidav, and he said to his students, Tze'u v'chishvu, it was Friday. He said, go and declare those pieces of wood as seats for us so we can sit on them tomorrow. So what did he say you could do? Declare it. However, velo yadana, the report was, I don't know, ibeta mishtehava, ibeta evel hava. Either there was a wedding going on that day, or there was a shiv'ah going on that day. So why did he mention that? So midika amar ibeta mishte hava ibeta evel hava davka beta evel beta mishte the 3 day avalacha kasher in lo kasher lo, implying that really Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva would have wanted them to tie these pieces of wood into mats, but they didn't have the time because there was either a wedding going on or there was a shiva going on. So therefore, he told them just quickly go out and declare them as seating for tomorrow. But the implication is, if they hadn't been terudim, if they hadn't been under time pressure, he would have wanted them to tie it. So you see that really he holds, ideally, that it should be tied together. So you need to do an action to change it to show that it has a new designation. Amar Rav Yehuda says, Machnis adam b'lo kupato afar v'oseh b'kol tzurachav, or kol tzurko. A person can bring a bucket of dirt and use it on Shabbat for anything he needs, to cover excrement, to cover spittle, to cover whatever, cover messes. That's what they used to use. We think dirt is a mess, right? If there was dirt in your house, you would think it was the mess. But if you have a dirt floor, okay, you have a dirt floor and somebody spills soda, they didn't have soda, but whatever. Somebody spills food, dirt is actually fixing it, putting dirt. so they were, right, cleaning up is by dirting it instead of cleaning, right? So they had a pile of dirt. So he says you can take a pile of dirt. Now dirt is normally muktzeh because it's used for all kinds of non-Shabbat purposes, but you can take this pile of dirt and you can designate it for Shabbat. And you make a corner for it in your house. The Rash Mar Zutra said, Mishmed de Mar Zutra Rabbah, in the name of Mar Zutra Rabbah, Fushi Yechedlo Keren Zavit. You have to set aside a corner for it to show that it's not just part, because otherwise if you just lay it out, it becomes part of the floor. Because remember, the floor is dirt. So you have to make a pile of it in a corner and say, this dirt here is not part of the floor, it is for Shabbat use. Amru Rabbanan Kamei de Rav Papa. The rabbi said in front of Rav Papa, Keman, ki Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. This must be following Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, because remember, we have this basic machloket. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, all you need to do is designate. Okay? You don't have to do anything to an item to change its designation. You just have to say it. Dika Rabbanan, because if we're following the other rabbis, because the other rabbis said you needed to do an action. You needed to tie the wood. Here you're not tying, you're just putting the dirt on the floor and saying you want it for Shabbat. That supports Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. So, I'm sorry, I skipped. Amar lahu, Rav Papa answered them. Afilu tema Rabbanan. You could even say that the rabbis would agree about the dirt. Because ad kan lo kamri Rabbanan debinan maaseh elamidi debar avida be'maaseh. Because the rabbis only said that you needed to do something to redesignate when it's possible. Aval did lav bar me'avda be'maaseh lo. But something that's doesn't lend itself to. What are you going to do with the dirt? Tie the dirt? You can't do anything with it. So there, everybody agrees. Designation is all you can do. It's just when there's a possibility of doing something. I guess that wasn't possible. But when there's a possibility of doing something to change the dirt itself, like tying the reeds together, that's one thing. When there's no available option, then we say that what designation is all you can do. Maybe we can find that this is a machloket tanaim, whether dirt can be designated or not. Because we find Vatani in a Braita as follows. We find in a Mishnah as follows. Bakol chafinat hakelim chutz miklei kesef begartikon. Okay, you're allowed to polish or wipe vessels, except for klei kesef, silver vessels with, what is it called? Tartar, whatever it's called. I forget what it's called. So, yeah, it's some kind of a caustic cleaner that you use on silver. Not tartar sauce, What is it called that you use? I
Right,
forget what it's called. I forget what it's called.
Right.
The polish that you use. You're not allowed to use the polish
Like
because
ammonia.
right. You're not allowed to use the polish that's actually going to. Now Rashi says the reason is because it scrapes off a layer of the silver. The Rambam says because it's like finishing off the vessel because you're polishing it to be perfect. So you're not allowed to use this caustic, very very fine polish. But anything else you can clean vessels on Shabbat because you're not really effectuating any change besides removing dirt. Okay, ha neter v'chol mutar. That means soap or dust, dirt. In other words, you can use sand to wash off a vessel. It's no problem. But then we have ve'atani. We learned in another braita neter v'chol asur that you can't use soap and you cannot use sand in order to clean vessels. So there's a machloket. Can you use sand? So perhaps we could say like this that. My love that maybe one says you need to do an action to designate sand for Shabbat use because normally sand would be muktzeh anyway. So how are you using it to clean your vessels, the sand? How can you polish your vessels with sand on Shabbat? Sand is muktzeh. So one says you need to do an action to designate, and since there's no action you can do to designate sand, you can't use it. And the other one says, you know what? Since there's no action you can do to designate sand, it's okay. Maybe that's the machloket. But the Gemara says, no. That's not really the machloket. Everybody agrees that when it comes to sand, there's nothing you can do. All you do is verbally designate it if you want to use it. It's no problem. Really, this is the machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. That when you use that professional grade, so to speak, polish, there everybody agrees you can't do it. But using sand, you don't intend really to eliminate the top layer of the silver, as Rashi would say, or to polish it to its full perfection, the Rambam would say. You don't intend for that. You're just cleaning it off. Okay?
It's like washing a dish.
Right, it's like washing a dish. You don't expect to revolutionize the dish. Okay? So Rabbi Yehuda says davar she'en mitkaven asur. Even though it's not your intention, since you may in fact polish it, you're not allowed to do it. Rabbi Shimon says that since you don't intend to polish it on a professional level, mutar. That's why he allows you to use sand. But then the Gemara says, "B'may okimta leha disharei ki Rabbi Shimon." You're telling me that the one who permits is Rabbi Shimon. But wait a second. What about the end of that statement? The end of that statement, which we didn't quote before, was that it says you cannot wipe your hair with these other things. In other words, you can't use sand to clean your hair. I guess they would use that to clean out your hair from different things. Okay, via Rabbi Shimon, and if Rabbi Shimon is the author of this statement, Mishra Kasherei, Rabbi Shimon certainly would allow you to use shampoo in your hair, so to speak, on Shabbat, because we see that Nazir chofef umefasfes avalo sorek, that a Nazir is allowed to clean his hair even with neter v'chol, even with soap or with sand, and he's allowed to separate his hairs, untangle his hairs. We're not worried that he's going to pull a hair out, because the Nazir is not allowed to cut his hair, he's not allowed to pull out his hair. So the law for a Nazir during the week is the same as the law for an average ordinary person on Shabbat. Okay? So Rabbi Shimon says he can do that as long as he doesn't sorek, he doesn't use like a tool that will inevitably pull out hair. Okay? So Rabbi Shimon would allow him then to clean his hair with these cleaners that may but won't definitely pull out hair. Okay? So therefore it can't be Rabbi Shimon. It can't be Rabbi Shimon.
Statement with regards to the what is it called, the gar tekon, right?
Right. Everybody agreed on the gar tekon.
But was he talking about the gar tekon?
No, in your hair it's neter v'chol, sand or the soap that they use. So therefore we have to assume elahav veha Rabbi Yehudahi. Rather, both statements must be Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda is the only one who would say you can't wash your hair with this stuff. Rabbi Shimon would definitely say it's okay. So the position that Rabbi Yehuda is, one version of Rabbi Yehuda must be saying you're allowed to use it with vessels but not with your hair, and the other one is saying you can't use it with either. Utrei Tana'ei Aliba de Rabbi Yehuda. It's two versions of Rabbi Yehuda. Hai Tana'ali de Rabbi Yehuda savar garir, v'hai Tana'aliba de Rabbi Yehuda savar lo garir. The question is whether whatever sand does to a vessel counts as polishing it. So everybody agrees that Rabbi Yehuda says that even an unintentional result is significant. The only question is the result produced by the sand really considered a polishing or not? And that's why you have a machloket. But everybody would agree that if it were polishing, you wouldn't be allowed to do it according to Rabbi Yehuda. That's not even a question.
But, if you have steam in your hair from this, you kill them, would that be okay?
That's another story. No, well, it's another story. It's complicated. Okay. Okay, so now, b'mayo kimta to Rabbi Yehuda. So you're saying that this is Rabbi Yehuda now. So sefa aval panav yadav v'raglav mutar. How come it says then you can't wash your hair with this stuff because you might pull out hair, but it says you can wash your face and your hands with it? But wait a second. Aren't you also going to take hair off of your hands? If this takes hair out of your head, won't take hair off your hands, hair off your face? Maybe it's a child. Maybe it's a woman. Or maybe a person who doesn't have facial hair or doesn't have hair on their hands. In other words, when he said you could use it to wash your face and your hands, it meant in a case where there's no hair there that we have to be concerned is going to be pulled out. That's all. So now we say, Amar Rav Yehuda says, Afar levinta sharei. You can use ground up frankincense to wash your face. We're not worried that it's going to pull hair out on Shabbat. Amar Rav Yosef says, Kuspadi yasmin. You can use kuspadi yasmin, which Rashi says means you can use the byproduct, the leftover product of shum shemin, of sesame. Apparently they would use that as a facial cream, a facial cleanser. Amar Rava says, Afar pilpele sharei. You can use pepper, ground pepper to clean your face. I have never heard of any of these things, but you never know nowadays with all this, homeopathic stuff. Amar Rav Shesha says, berada sharei. You can use berada to clean your face. My berada, what's berada? Amar Rav Yosef, tilta ahla, 1/3 aloe, v'tilta asa, 1/3 myrtle, v'tilta sigle, and 1/3 violet. In other words, the extract of all of this is mixed together, or it's crushed together into a powder, and it's used to wash your face. It's not going to take hair off. Amar Rav Nechemia bar Yosef, kolecha deleka ruba ahala shapir. Actually, it doesn't have to be 1/3 aloe. Even up to 1/2 aloe is still mild enough that it won't pull the hair off, and it's okay. And according to Rashi, what this means is, are you allowed to crush zetim? Are you allowed to crush olives in order to eat them? Because apparently by squishing them, they became sweeter. But you would also lose the juice. You would waste the juice. Well, you're doing it in the course of eating, right? So you're squishing it. So Amar Lahu said to him, did anybody allow this? On chol, on weekday? He said, you're ruining the olive, you're wasting the oil by squishing it. Why would you do that? Squishing it and then eating it. This is an argument with Shmuel. Shmuel says, Shmuel said you can use bread for anything you want. In other words, you want to wipe your face with bread, it's okay. You want to wipe your face with, you want to use olives to wipe your face, it's fine. So they said, no, Amrei, pat lo me'isa, hane me'ise. That since bread won't become ruined by some alternate uses. Let's say you want to put your keys on the bread. I don't know, you want to use your bread to pass something to somebody with bread. Whatever. So then you could do it won't ruin it. But olives, if you squish them, they're going to become ruined. And that's why Rashi says that whether you are using it for eating or for whatever the purpose is, you can't squish these olives even during the week because it's considered a waste of food. You're ruining food, Rav Papa says. Amemar Mar Zutra, Rav Ashe Havu Get Vei. Amemar and Mar Zutra and Rav Ashe were sitting. Aitula Kamayu Barada. They brought to them this type of facial cleanser that was made of aloe, and it was made of myrtle, and it was made of violets. Amemar Rav Ashe Mashu. So Amemar and Rav Ashe washed with it. Mar Zutra lo Masha. But Mar Zutra would not use it. Amrule, they said to him, Lo savar mar lahad amar Rav Sheshet barada sharei. Don't you agree with what Rav Sheshet said, that you're allowed to wash your face with this on Shabbat? It's no problem. Amar lahu, he said to them, Rav Mordechai said to them, in other words, instead of Mar Zutra answering for himself, Rav Mordechai answered for him. Amar lahu, Rav Mordechai, bar minei demar. Don't even talk about Mar Zutra. Because even on the weekday he won't use facial cleanser. Why not? Savar la ki haditanya megarer adam gildei tzavel gildei makam shal bisaro b'shvil tzaro in b'shvil yapot asur. He says a man is not allowed to be grooming himself Any cosmetic activity, including facial cleanser, is not allowed. He says you can take you can take excrement, you can take dirt off of yourself. If you have a scab, you can remove that. Anything that's bothering you, b'shvil tsa'aro, anything that's bothering you, it's disgusting you, the dirt, you're allowed to. But to look beautiful, they call that metrosexual, right? That's what it's called today. That, according to Marzutra, you're not allowed to do that. No grooming.
All scraggly.
Yeah, ve'inu keman savrua. So what about the other rabbis? They hold kihad detanya rochetz adam panav yadav ragav b'chol yom, that a person should be beautiful. Why? Because it says kihad detanya. Oh, I'm sorry. B'chol yom b'shvil kono, because the honor of his creator. Mishum shnei kol po'al Hashem lemaneu, because it says all actions of God are for His sake. In other words, we have to honor Hashem through the way we appear. And so Rashi says that means two things. It means, first of all, you're honoring the Tzelem Elokim, you're created in the image of God. But also, by being beautiful, people will look at you and praise God and say, wow, what a good-looking, handsome guy he is. So you're going to inspire people to praise God. So it's a good thing to be grooming yourself. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, Kupa matel tzidav v'notel shema yitol. So we said before that, what was the problem? That if you insulate your pot with the gizeh tzemer, you insulate your pot with these shearings of wool. Now you want to take the pot out, you want to take the food out on Shabbat. The Chachamim say, take it out. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, no, you have to tilt the box on the side, take the top off, spill the food out, and leave it in the box. Don't take it out of the box. Why? Because if you take it out of the box, what's going to happen? All of those gizeh tzemer are going to cave in, and then you won't be able to put the pot back in. So you should leave the pot in and do this. And the rabbi said, don't worry about it. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Ashi. So Rabbi Abba said that Rabbi Chia bar Ashi said, and let's see, is that Amar Rav supposed to be there or not? Some say no. Okay. So Hakol modim sheim nitkalkela haguma shasur lachzir. It's not that the rabbis are saying that if the gizeh tzemer, in other words, it would sound from the Mishnah like the rabbis are saying that even if it caves in, take the pot out, and even if it caves in, you can put the pot back in. They're not saying that. Everybody agrees if it caves in, you can't do anything. Shasur lachzir. V'chachamim omrim notelo machzir. So, but the thing is that the Chachamim say you can take it out and put it back in. So hechidame, what are they talking about? So if they're talking about where it didn't cave in, no problem. Shapir ka'amre Rabbanan ela lav afal pi nitkalkela haguma. It sounds from the rabbis. In other words, why are the rabbis telling you can take it out and put it back in? If it didn't cave in, everybody agrees you can put it back in. If it did cave in, how can the rabbis allow you to put it back in once it's filled with the muktzeh gizeh tzemer? So le'olam de lo nitkalkela. What the rabbis are talking about is a case where it didn't cave in. Really, everybody agrees if it caves in, you can't put it back in. Okay, one of the reasons for this is because even if muktzeh is not the issue, it looks like you're doing a new hatmana on Shabbat. It looks like you're doing a new active insulation because it doesn't look like you're returning it anymore because it filled in and now you're making the hole again. You can't do that. That's the problem. The concern here is for chosheshin, meaning, do we have to be worried that it will cave in? Mar savar chosheshin shema nitkalkela haguma, umar savar en chosheshin, that one is concerned, maybe the gizeh tzemer, maybe the insulation is going to cave in, and one is not concerned. So everybody agrees if it falls in, you can't put it back in. Either because of muktzeh reasons, or because you're starting a new hatmana on Shabbat. You're starting a new insulation on Shabbat. But the question is, are you not allowed to take out the pot because if you do, maybe it will cave in? Do we tell you not to take it out because maybe it will cave in and then maybe you'll be tempted to replace it anyway? So the rabbis say we're not worried about that eventuality, about that possibility. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is saying we are worried about that possibility. Amar Ravuna says, Hi, silikusta. They used to put these flowers into soft earth. And if you put it in on Shabbat and you took it out and you put it back in other words, you created a large hole in the dirt, then you can take these flowers out even on Shabbat. It's no problem. However, if you didn't do that, if you didn't do that, you can't. Why? Because you're going to be moving the dirt on Shabbat when you put it back in. or when you take it out. If you moved it already in and out a couple of times, so the hole is big enough that by removing it and putting it back in, it won't make any bigger hole. It won't cause any greater hole to be formed, and it won't move the dirt around in any significant way.
The note here says that this is a plant that was fragrant, and the custom.
Yeah, you would take it. It was like Besamim. You would take it and put it back in.
Put it back.
Right.
It was meant
To be taken out in it, right? Amar Shmuel says, "Hay sakina de beni orvei." That's shalfa vadar. That's shari. Vilavasir. Similarly, he said they would stick their knife into the brick wall for safekeeping, so that nobody would get nicked by the blade, I guess. So if you put it in and out of the wall before, so the hole is nice and sizable there, you don't have to worry about pulling it out. That you're going to either make a hole in the wall or that you're moving brick, because brick is obviously muktzeh on Shabbat. So that's okay. But if you just stuck it in Erev Shabbat, and by pulling it out you're going to be making a hole, or by pulling it out you're going to be moving muktzeh things, you wouldn't be allowed to do it. Mar Zutravi Tema Rav Ashe Amar Begordita de Kane Shapir. You can also stick it in between the sticks of the when you had what's it called?
Combo of reeds.
The reeds, right? Reeds, right? If you have a bunch of reeds and you stick it into the reeds, it's a similar thing. If you stuck it in and out before Shabbat so that it has a nice, comfortable place there, then you can pull it out on Shabbat itself. If not, you can't. So now we'll end off with this last point. So then Shapir Dem. So right. So Rav Ashe says begordita de kane Shapir Dem. You can also do this with reeds, the sticking it among the reeds and pulling it out from among the reeds. Okay. So now. Amar le Rav Mordechai le Rava. Rav Mordechai said to Rava, Mativ Rav Katina Tiyuftai. Did you know that Rav Katina refuted this halacha? How did he refute it? Because Hatomen lefed utznono tachat gefen. They used to sometimes store vegetables underground. Sounds strange to us, but they would do that.
Is this Mordechai from Purim?
No, Rav Mordechai. So you would put it under. It says under the vine. You would stick these vegetables in the dirt. If the leaves are sticking out from the ground, it's no problem. In other words, you can pull it out on Shabbat even. It's not a concern that you're mixing diverse seeds. Because think about it, you're putting in a lefet, you're putting a turnip in a vineyard. You're not allowed to mix things with a vineyard, to plant mixed seeds. But as long as it's a plant, though, you're planting another vegetable, okay? Velo mishum shvi'it, you don't have to worry about shemitah. If it's shemitah and you stuck it in the ground, it's not considered planting during shemitah to put that in there, as long as it's sticking out. Velo mishum ma'aser, and it's not a concern that maybe it's going to grow a little bit when it's under there, and now you're going to have to give more ma'aser if you gave ma'aser for it already. Okay, why? Because it's still sticking out. V'nitalin b'Shabbat, and you can pull it right out of the ground on Shabbat. So tiyufta, that shows you that this halacha is refuted. In other words, all these halachot about, you can't put it in the dirt, you have to make a really big hole because you might move the dirt. You see that that's not true, because you can put a turnip or you can put a radish in the dirt as long as your intent, the Shulchan Aruch says, as long as your intent is not to plant it. Your intent was just to temporarily store it, and its leaves are sticking out. Okay, so that way it's clear that it's meant to be pulled out of the ground. It's not meant to be planted. You can do that even on Shabbat, even though you're moving dirt, and we're not concerned that you're making a hole on Shabbat, and we're not concerned that you're moving the dirt on Shabbat. And that's where we're going to conclude for today.